can I ask you just all how each of you would summarise the EU's current trade strategy and how it's evolved in recent years? Who wants to kick off?
Well, I'll start because we've been conspiring a little how to handle this between the three of us. I'm going to make 3 points, and then I'll pass on, and we're going to share this. The first is that the EU has always been a very strong supporter of the international trade rules, in other words, the GATT in its day and the WTO afterwards. And the reasons for that are pretty clear, because all member states at any stage of the numbers in the EU are dependent for their GDP to the extent of 60-70% on trade. So clearly they needed a framework of trade, and it's a liberal, free trade, open markets kind of framework. Point 2, the Treaty of Rome itself is a customs union, and therefore the basis for relations, trade agreements with third countries has always been a free trade basis. Customs unions originally in the 1960s with Turkey and with Greece, free trade agreements all around. And that's been the basis. It's evolved a bit into association agreements and more recently into things like the Barcelona framework and the neighbourhood policies. But it's basically that kind of thing. But I should mention that there's an LDC, developing country component, which goes into things like the GSP, which is a tariff thing, but there are other things as well in terms of non-tariff barriers. And point 3 is that the EU's trade policy has evolved as the global economy has evolved. And this means things like globalization, the internet, and the very large changes in transport, whether it's by air or by sea, which affect trade. You now know about changing patterns of production, which is facilitated by things like global value chains. And indeed, the pattern of trade now has changed around the world. So you have countries producing which were much less producers before, and the people who were the producers are now almost embedded with the producers, particularly in Asia. I'll pass on.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll focus a little bit on the last 5 years because we are facing a renewal of leadership in the European Union with the European elections, and there will be a new commission coming, so it's a good moment to take stock a little bit of what has happened. I would say that in the last 5 years what has really happened is the play out of the new treaty, the Lisbon Treaty that came into force in 2011, I think, 2010. But it's in this legislature that all the dynamics that were written in there have actually played out. And I see 2 developments in trade. One is the fact that the European Parliament now plays a much more important role in setting the agenda for trade and giving it sort of different orientations and different priorities. And also there are new competencies that were transferred to the EU level, namely investment protection. So that has played out with a lot of, political battles between the Council, the Commission, and the European Parliament. It's been very intense on the trade policy front in the last 5 years, a very active trade policy, with a lot of successes in that sense. Recently, a major agreement with Japan came into force. There's an agreement with Singapore coming into force, a free trade agreement which will open the gates of ASEAN. Important agreement with Canada, CETA, that came into force provisionally. There are other agreements that were negotiated with Vietnam and Mexico, all important trading partners that are coming into force, expected to come into force and be ratified in the coming months. There are also a few challenging relations for the EU to manage. One is China, where the EU is trying to achieve a certain degree of investment liberalization through negotiations on an investment agreement, and it's trying to bring China into the fold of negotiations over the reform of the World Trade Organization, which is facing an existential crisis at the moment. We can get back to that later. And finally, there are many trade tensions at the moment with the United States, which is by far the EU's largest trading partner, also investment partner. Negotiations towards TTIP, a big transatlantic trade agreement, failed 3 years ago, and now the relationship has become a bit more contentious, with the United States introducing tariffs on steel and aluminium from the EU on the basis of national security, and threatening to impose similar restrictions on imports on the basis also of national security, which the EU contests. There is an attempt with the US to launch negotiations for a narrow agreement on industrial goods that focuses on very boring technical issues such as conformity assessment that would avoid duplication of paperwork for industrial products. And there is an attempt to launch negotiations on liberalization of tariffs. We can go back to all these issues later.
Thank you.
From a legal perspective, I suppose the last number of years have been a whirlwind of success for EU international relations law and the EU trying to prove its global activeness. And you see the Commissioner recently saying that EU-Japan was the first agreement where people aren't out protesting in the streets. So the civil society dimension to getting buy-in from the public has been very important. I think the transparency dimension to EU international relations has really taken legally an enormous significance, as we've seen in the Brexit negotiations. The Court of Justice has given its benefaction or its approval to the Singapore agreement, to CETA, given very great gifts to the EU, and I think these are quite important tools, legal tools that the EU has really benefited from, or in certain instances a clarification of its competences. The EU remains an incredible internationalist and institutionalizationist, if I can call it that. It wants to institutionalize things and support multilateralism, obviously in a crisis of multilateralism. So there's very important developments taking place as to the WTO. But I think really the EU's successes have been in its starting its shift towards Asia and the Americas. So the Japan agreement and the scale of it, and Singapore, what it's achieved. I think subtly in the background, legally, everything that's happening, we're watching what's happening as regards Switzerland and the UK. Obviously, these are the larger picture misses out in the smaller picture, and Turkey as well. So there's nothing much happening on these fronts. But the EU, of course, is carefully pinpointing all the negotiations. How do you institutionalise a relationship that doesn't want to be, for example, Switzerland? So the developments that are taking place in all of the post-Lisbon agreements with Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, Japan, it's all about regulatory cooperation at the global level, or globalising the relationship. And these are very important global ambitions that really do affect what's happening on the ground in other negotiations. I think a really interesting legal factor of the last number of years is also the proof of success. So it's not enough to negotiate these agreements. It's how to show that they're good agreements and that they have increased trade. So we see as to Korea in particular, we see enormous efforts. Japan also, not even a year after the agreement, the metrics for success, the metrics for bringing forward civil society, for showing that they're good agreements is legally becoming interesting. How the Commission tries to prove this has to say it has a methodology.